Session 5.
Welcome to Session 5 of the Dynamic Marriage course. This week in your textbook, handbook, and workbook, you'll work through the commonly felt emotional needs of desiring an attractive spouse in your own eyes and the desire for honesty and openness in your relationship. Openness and honesty go right along with what we've shared about developing intimacy in your relationship. In last week's message, we discussed giving your spouse permission to tell you the truth without fearing retribution from you. We also addressed accepting that whatever he or she feels is your spouse's reality. Even if you don't like or agree with your spouse's reality, it's still true for your spouse. Because it's your spouse's reality, don't attempt to pressure your spouse into lying about his or her emotions. Rather, allow your spouse to share his or her emotions and accept them for what they are. Don't tell your spouse what he or she should feel, or that you know better what he or she feels than your spouse does. Do you see the underlying message in all this? Accepting your spouse's feelings as his or her reality means you allow your spouse to be whoever he or she really is. When you think about it, that's the way God loves each of us. Romans 5, verses 7 and 8 say, "But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." This means that none of us can do anything to earn the love of God. He loved each of us because he chooses to, even with all of our flaws and faults. By God's grace, we can love our spouses and receive their love in the same way. Over the many years we hope to be together with our mates, we can focus on the good in our spouses. In turn, our spouses can see the good in each of us, while relegating the bad in each of us to the grace of God. Knowing each other's weaknesses, idiosyncrasies, and flaws, we can love our spouses anyway. We all desperately need this. We all need to love our spouses just as they are, with no agenda to redesign them into something they must be to earn our love. Our spouses need us to love them just as they are, accepting the reality of who they are and loving them without having to do anything or be anything to earn our love. Isn't that what we want from our spouses? It's definitely what our spouses want from us. Learning to accept the reality of another person's thoughts, emotions, likes, dislikes, wants, needs, and desires is an integral function of learning to love each other like God loves us. That's what we shared in these last two messages. Part of learning to love our spouses in this way is to give our spouses permission to tell us the truth about everything. When we give our spouses this permission to tell us all the truth about the facts of their lives and about their feelings associated with those facts without censure, disapproval, or ridicule, we automatically move toward deeper levels of intimacy in our marriages. Loving another person with this type of God love doesn't mean, however, that we'll always be with the person in everything he or she does. For example, our spouses should love us, warts and all. Perhaps you're a recovering alcoholic or have been habitually irresponsible with your spending. Your spouse should still love you if you started drinking again or started racking up enormous credit card debts again. However, your spouse might choose not to live with you as long as you insist on destroying yourself and putting the family at risk. Loving your spouse doesn't mean that you tolerate any and all behavior from that spouse. If one spouse were having an affair, no one would expect the other to stay in the marriage if the offending spouse continued in the affair indefinitely. To save the marriage, the unfaithful spouse would have to stop the relationship with the other person in hopes that the offender would come to his or her senses. In other words, accepting what your spouse feels or thinks or does isn't the same thing as blindly accepting some terrible thing he or she keeps doing. Every action destroying a marriage must cease. With that said, let's explain a little more about developing intimacy. Rather than talking about what to do in your communications to develop intimacy, perhaps we should spend a little time in talking about what not to do. Let's start by sharing something we've discovered in our A New Beginning workshop, our turnaround weekend for couples in crisis. By the grace of God, our success rate in saving the marriages of couples in serious trouble is nothing short of remarkable. If you're interested in knowing more about this workshop for couples you know who are ready to give up on their marriages, You can find out more about this powerful workshop on the website SaveMyMarriage.com. Again, that's SaveMyMarriage.com. Since that seminar is for couples in crisis, you can imagine that we hear intense things about what gets marriages into trouble. One common theme leading couples into crisis is one spouse feeling that the other is constantly judging, criticizing, or dismissing the thoughts of the other. A couple begins discussing some subject, perhaps politics, religion, or even which baseball team may win the pennant. One spouse constantly tells the other, either directly or indirectly, that he or she is wrong or naive or dim-witted. What the demeaned spouse hears in such a conversation is, "Honey, you're not smart enough to see the things I see. Therefore, I need to teach you to see things more clearly, to help you think better. Listen to me and I'll show you the way." The demeaned spouse hears nothing but condescension. The demeaned spouse feels disrespected, belittled, and minimized. What needs to be very clear here is that our intention is not nearly as important as our spouse's perception of our words and actions. We may not mean to be negative by our comments, but if our spouses hear a put down, no matter how subtle, our spouses will resent it just the same. If we talk to our spouses in this way often or regularly over time, that resentment becomes massive. At Family Dynamics Institute, we've often heard one spouse say about the other, "I don't care if he agrees with me or not, I just want to know that he sees I have a point, that he can understand why I think that way. I just want to be validated as a reasoning adult and not treated like I'm his child who hasn't matured enough to understand." If you're thinking some couples might misread each other like that, but that you two never would, allow me to give you a challenge. Ask your spouse if he or she ever feels you come across the way we're describing. Ask him or her if there are ever feelings of just wanting validation from you. Before you ask, remember you must accept the answer your spouse gives you as his or her reality. As such, it's not an arguable point. It's your spouse's reality, his or her truth. If your spouse says to you, "As I listened to that question in this week's student CD message, I thought to myself, yeah, I do feel that way," then any response you give must evidence that you accept that your spouse feels demeaned by some of your responses. Any other response will only confirm in your spouse's heart that you habitually demean his or her views. The only beneficial response in such circumstances is to listen carefully and to accept that this is the way your spouse thinks or feels. We don't mean to imply that you can never discuss differences of opinion. Such discussions are healthy, but only if the other person feels respected and validated. At Family Dynamics Institute, we've heard many spouses say, if he were to just say, "I see how you think that. I don't see it like that, but it makes sense that you've reached that conclusion." If he'd just do that, then we could discuss as long as he wanted to. However, I don't want him to lecture me. I want him to hear me and respect me. I might even change my mind once I heard his reasoning. Instead, I feel only resentment that I'm being forced to accept his position. It's all about respect. In our A New Beginning workshop for couples in crisis, we point out that the three most important components in a relationship are truth, respect, and decisions. To be more specific, we tell couples in distress that if they want to build their deteriorating relationships, they must always speak the truth, but do it with respect for the other person's feelings and dignity. In addition, make right decisions, and you'll make the relationship not just work, but come alive. That's biblical, isn't it? We can sum up truth tempered with respect in Ephesians 4:15, speaking the truth in love. But Ephesians 4 and verse 29 affirms this concept as well. Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. This last verse says that anything we say to another person, even our spouses, that is contrary to building them up according to their needs is unwholesome talk. Common sense tells us that unwholesome talk should not come from our mouths, especially in our marriages. Let's address one more point about developing intimacy by talking openly and honestly with our spouses. Just as you will inhibit open sharing by coming across as condescending, you'll also inhibit intimacy by saying things that may be truthful, but that cannot build up the other person. In this week's homework in your book, workbook, and handbook, one of the topics is the emotional needs some have for an attractive spouse. What if in your discussions with each other, one were to ask the other, "Honey, are there any changes you'd like me to make to become more attractive?" How should the other person answer? Notice that the question isn't, "Would I need to make some changes so that you'll love me?" We've already talked about how love is not based on what the other person is or does. The question is, are there any changes I could make to be more attractive to you? If a husband were to ask his wife a question like that, she should be very careful in her answer, but she should do her best to answer it honestly. We need to be intentional about making everything in our marriages honest and open. However, as we just pointed out from the verses in Ephesians, we should temper our honesty with a large measure of love that produces a wholesome reaction from our mates. If a wife were to reply, "Well, you'd be more attractive if you were 6 inches taller. I've always thought that men about 6'4" are really hot," then her answer would not be an answer that would in any way build up her 5'10" husband. Why? Because he couldn't add 6 inches to his height. No matter how hard he tried, he could not grow from 5'10" to 6'4". Consequently, requesting anything of your spouse that he or she cannot physically, emotionally, or spiritually do is not healthy for your relationship. Criticizing or condemning your spouse for anything that he or she is helpless to change isn't loving or healthy. On the other hand, if a wife were to answer the same question with, "Honey, now that you mention it, I'd find you more attractive if you'd get in better shape and lose 20 pounds. That would be perfectly acceptable and actually should be a topic she can share with her husband without his becoming defensive or hurt. If she forgot to make her request with love, her request could end up like, "When we go to the beach, I'd like to have a real man, not a beach twirl at my side." If he had a hormonal problem that prevented him from losing weight, the wife's asking him to lose the weight when she knew that he physically couldn't would not be very loving either. But if he had the capability, but just hadn't shown the discipline so far, then she has every right to talk to him about her feelings, and he should hear and accept them as being real. If he wanted to be a servant to her, as we've discussed before, he'd develop the discipline to lose the weight. Not to make her love him. That would devastate him emotionally to think he had to be a certain size to be loved. His motivation would be to make himself more attractive to and for her. It's the motive of service, not slavery. He'd lose the weight because he wanted to, not because he had to. Since you're currently reading the chapters on honesty and attractiveness, try talking openly and honestly about attractiveness this week. Don't be judgmental, critical, condescending, or caustic. Give full acceptance to what the other feels or thinks. Don't demand anything from your spouse in order for you to love him or her more. When you talk openly and honestly about what is attractive to you, you may be surprised by what you hear. Maybe the wife wants her husband to floss better. Perhaps he'll want her to wear a favorite color more often. Maybe each asks the other to develop more discipline in exercise and diet to be more physically attractive. Whatever you share, do it honestly, in love, and wholesomely. Offer to help the other accomplish anything you've requested. For example, if you ask him to lose 20 pounds, maybe you help him by creating a completely new diet for the both of you. Perhaps you start an exercise program with him that you can do together. If you truly wish to give servant love, you'll do the things your spouse requests to make you more attractive, because you want to, not because you have to. Therefore, there will be no resentment or emotional backlash. Together, you'll find joy in ministering to the emotional needs and desires of the other. Get started on this conversation right away. Don't wait until the last minute and find yourself stressed or hurried. Make plenty of time to talk and plenty of time to hear. In your closing activity in class this next week, we'll ask you to share honestly with your group just how far you've come in your marriage so far in this course. Take this exercise seriously. If you honestly have to admit that you've not come far, think between now and the next class what you need to turn this around. Then, for the sake of your marriage, make a commitment to do whatever it takes for the rest of this class to make your marriage the priority it should be. If, on the other hand, you've both worked hard at improving your marriage and you see clearly the fruits of your labor, share with the group what those improvements are. In the process, you'll not only encourage yourselves, you'll also encourage the other couples to keep working on their marriages. Session 5 will be a great time of growth and discovery. Have a great class and keep growing in love.